Hey guys, it's a beautiful day out there, is it not? Holla. Um, you'll have to excuse the fact that I don't sound like my normal glorious self because I have a lot of jazz going on up here. But I'm going to do grit anyways. You'll also have to excuse the fact that I'm going to read for probably 20 minutes. And I know nobody has time to sit down and watch a 20-minute video, whatever, but if you're into this book and if you're into being gritty, just turn it on, listen to it while you do chores or while you're driving. I mean, just turn it on and listen to it and let it play while you're driving. Don't watch it while you're driving. You don't really need to watch it. You just need to hear me. Yeah? Cool. So, here we go. Where are we at? Oh, we're finishing up How Gritty Are You? Going into Grit Grows, and then tomorrow we're going to do Growing Grit from the Inside Out, which is one of my personal faves. Blah, blah, blah about Bob. The next year, he sold 13 cartoons to the New Yorker. Then 25 the following year. Then 27. In 1981, Bob received a letter from the magazine asking if he'd consider becoming a contract cartoonist. He said yes. In his role as editor and mentor, Bob advises aspiring cartoonists to submit their drawings in batches of 10, because in cartooning, as in life, 9 out of 10 things never work out. If that ain't the truth. Indeed, giving up on lower-level goals is not only forgivable, it's sometimes absolutely necessary. You guys remember the chart with the low-level goals, mid-level goals, high-level goals? Yeah. You should give up when one low-level goal can be swapped for another that is more feasible. It also makes sense to switch your path when a different lower-level goal, a different means to the same end, is just more efficient or more fun, or for whatever reason makes more sense than your original plan. On any long journey, detours are to be expected. However, the higher level the goal, the more it makes sense to be stubborn. Personally, I try not to get too hung up on a particular rejected grant application, academic paper, or failed experiment. The pain of those failures is real, but I don't dwell on them for long before moving on. In contrast, I don't give up as easily on mid-level goals, and frankly, I can't imagine anything that would change my ultimate aim, my life philosophy, as Pete might say. My compass, once I found all the parts and put it together, keeps pointing me in the same direction, week after month after year. Long before I conducted the first interviews that put me on the trail of grit, a Stanford psychologist named Catherine Cox was herself cataloging the characteristics of high achievers. In 1926, Cox published her findings based on the biographical details of 301 exceptionally accomplished historical figures. Oh, of 301. I don't know what I thought 301 was, like an address or something. Based on the biographical details of 301 exceptionally accomplished historical figures. These eminent individuals included poets, political and religious leaders, scientists, soldiers, philosophers, artistes, and musicians. All lived and died in the 4 centuries prior to Cox's investigation, and all left behind records of accomplishment worthy of documentation in 6 popular encyclopedias. Cox's initial goal was to estimate how smart each of these individuals were, both relative to one another and also compared to the rest of humanity. In pursuit of those estimates, she combed through the available evidence, searching for signs of intellectual precocity. I don't know. And from the age and superiority of these accomplishments, she reckoned each person's childhood IQ. The published summary of this study, if you can call a book of more than 800 pages a summary, 800 pages? Holy. Includes a case history for each of Cox's 301, arranged in order from least to most intelligent. According to Cox, the very smartest in the bunch was the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who earned an estimated childhood IQ score of 190 by learning Greek at age 3, writing a history of Rome at age 6, and assisting his father in correcting the proofs of a history of India at age 12. The least intelligent in Cox's ranking, whose estimated childhood IQs of 100 to 110 are just a hair above average for humanity, included the founder of modern astronomy, Nicholas Copernicus, the chemist and physicist Michael Faraday, and the Spanish poet and novelist Miguel de Cervantes. Isaac Newton ranks squarely in the middle, with an IQ of 130. the bare minimum that a child needs in order to qualify for many of today's gifted and talented programs. From these IQ estimates, Cox concluded that as a group, accomplished historical figures are smarter than most of us. No surprise there. A more unexpected observation was how little IQ mattered in distinguishing, OMG, too much Mucinex, in distinguishing the most from the least accomplished. The average childhood IQ of the most eminent geniuses, whom Cox dubbed the first 10, was 146. The average IQ of the least eminent, dubbed the last 10, was 143. The spread was trivial. In other words, the relationship between intelligence and eminence in Cox's sample was exceedingly slight. Cox's first 10 most eminent geniuses: Sir Francis Bacon, Napoleon Bonaparte, Edmund Burke, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Martin Luther, John Milton, Isaac Newton, William Pitt, Voltaire, and George Washington. In the last 10, aka the least eminent geniuses, Christian K.J. von Bunsen, Thomas Chalmers, Thomas Chatterton, Richard Cobden, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Jorge J. Danton, Joseph Haydn, Hughes Felicity Robert de Lamennais. What are they trying to do to me? Giuseppe Mazzini and Joachim Murat. If intellectual talent wasn't the determination of whether a person ascended to the first 10 or was relegated to the last 10, then what was? While poring over thousands of pages of biographical data, Cox and her assistant also evaluated 67 different personality traits for a subset of 100 geniuses. Cox deliberately chose a rainbow of traits. In fact, she covered the full range of what modern psychologists consider to be important, to allow for the fullest possible exploration of the differences that set apart the eminent from the rest of humanity, and further, the first 10 from the last 10. For most of the 67 indicators, Cox found only trivial differences between the eminent and the general population. For instance, eminence had little to do with extroversion, cheerfulness, or sense of humor. I have that. And not all the high achievers had earned high marks in high school. Oh, good. I did not. Rather, what definitively set apart the eminent from the rest of humanity were a cluster of 4 indicators. Notably, these also distinguished the first 10 from the last 10, the super-eminent from the merely eminent. Cox grouped these together and called them persistence of motive. 2 indicators could easily be rephrased as passion items for the grit scale: degree to which he works with distant objects in view, as opposed to living from hand to mouth; active preparation for later life, working toward a definite goal; tendency not to abandon tasks from mere changeability, not seeking something fresh because of novelty, and not looking for a change. The other 2 could easily be rewritten as perseverance items for the grit scale: degree of strength of will or perseverance, quiet determination to stick to a course once decided upon, tendency not to abandon tasks in the face of obstacles, perseverance, tenacity, and doggedness. Hello, that's me. Is that y'all too? Hope so. In her summary comments, Cox concluded that high but not the highest intelligence combined with the greatest degree of persistence will achieve greater eminence than the highest degree of intelligence with somewhat less persistence. However, you scored on the grit scale. I hope it prompted self-reflection. It's progress just clarifying your goals and the extent to which they are, or aren't, aligned toward a single passion of supreme importance. It's also progress to better understand how well you're currently able to persevere in the face of life's rejection slips. Those damn things. It's a start. Let's continue in the next chapter to see how grit can and does change. And then in the rest of the book, let's learn how to accelerate that growth. Woo woo! Chapter 5, Grit Grows. How much of our grit is in our genes? I'm asked some version of this question pretty much anytime I give a talk on grit. The nature to nurture question is a very basic one. We have an intuitive sense that some things about us, like our height, are pretty much determined in the genetic lottery, while other things, like whether we speak English or French, are a result of our upbringing and experience. You can't train height is a popular expression in basketball coaching. And how many people who learn about grit want to know if it's more like height or more like language? To the question of whether we get grit from our DNA, there is a short answer and a long one. The short answer is, in part. The long answer is, well, more complicated. In my view, the longer answer is worth our attention. Science has made huge strides in figuring out how genes, experience, and their interplay make us who we are. From what I can tell, the inherent complexity of these scientific facts has led, unfortunately, to their continually being misunderstood. To begin, I can tell you with complete conviction that every human trait is influenced by both genes and experience. Consider height. Height is indeed heritable. Genetic differences are a big reason why some people are really tall, why some people are really short, and a bunch of people are of varying heights in between. But it's also true that the average height of men and women has increased dramatically in a few generations. For instance, military records show that the average British man was 5 feet 5 inches tall about 150 years ago, but today that average is 5 feet 10 inches. Height gains have been even more dramatic in other countries. In the Netherlands, the average man now stands almost 6'1", a gain of more than 6 inches over the last 150 years. I am reminded of these dramatic generational gains in height whenever I get together with my Dutch collaborators. They bend down solicitously, but it still feels like standing in a forest of redwoods. It's unlikely that the gene pool has changed all that dramatically in just a few generations. Instead, the most powerful height boosters have been nutrition, clean air and water, and modern medicine. Incidentally, generational gains in weight have been even more dramatic, and again, that seems to be the consequence of eating more and moving less rather than changes in our DNA. Even within a generation, you can see the influence of environment on height. Children who are provided healthy food in abundance will grow up taller, whereas malnourishment stunts growth. Likewise, traits like honesty and generosity and, yes, grit are genetically influenced and, in addition, influenced by experience. Ditto for IQ, extroversion. Enjoying the great outdoors, having a sweet tooth, the likelihood that you'll end up a chain smoker, your risk of getting skin cancer, and really any other trait you can think of. Nature matters, and so does nurture. Talents in all the varieties are also genetically influenced. Some of us are born with genes that make it easier to learn to carry a tune. I was not born with those genes. Dunk a basketball, solve a quadratic equation. Wasn't born with those genes either, but against intuition, talents are not entirely genetic. The rate at which we develop any skill is also crucially a function of experience. For instance, sociologist Dan Chambliss swam competitively in high school, but stopped when it seemed clear he wasn't going to make it as a nationally ranked swimmer. I'm small, he explained, and my ankles won't plantar flex. Come again? I can't point my toes. I can only flex them. It's an anatomical limitation, which means basically at the elite level I could only swim breaststroke. After our exchange, I did a little research on plantar flexion. Flexism. Whatever. Stretching exercises can improve your range of motion, but the length of certain bones does not make a difference. Oh, it does make a difference in how flexible your feet and ankles are. Still, the biggest impediment to improving wasn't anatomy, it was how he was coached. In retrospect, I look back now and can see I had horribly bad coaches in a couple of crucial places. One of my high school coaches, I had him for 4 years, literally taught me zero. Nothing. He taught me how to do a breaststroke turn, and he taught me incorrectly. What happened when Dan did finally experience good coaching? In part from hanging around the national and Olympic coaches he was studying. Years later, I got back into the pool, got in shape again, and swam a 200-yard individual medley as fast as I did in high school. Again, same story. Not just nature and not just nurture. Both. How do scientists know with unwavering conviction that both nature and nurture play a role in determining things like talent and grit? Over the past few decades, oh my god, you guys. Researchers have been studying identical and fraternal twins. Ooh, I have identical twins. Oh my god, they're so sweet. Raised in the same family or raised in different families. Identical twins have all the same DNA, while fraternal twins, on average, only share about half. That fact and a whole lot of fancy statistics, well, not that fancy, more mundane, really, once a good teacher explains them to you, allows researchers to infer from how similar the twins grow up to be the heritability of a trait. Very recently, researchers in London let me know they'd administered the grit scale to more than 2,000 pairs of teenage twins living in the United Kingdom. This study estimated the heritability of the perseverance subscale to be 37% and the passion subscale to be 20%. These estimates are on par for heritability estimates and are other and for other personality traits. And in the simplest terms, this means that some of the variation in grit in the population can be attributed to genetic factors, and the rest can be attributed to experience. I hasten to add that there isn't just one gene that explains the heritability of grit. On the contrary, dozens of research studies have shown that almost all human traits are polygenic, meaning that traits are influenced by more than one gene. Many more, in fact. Height, for example, is influenced by, at last count, at least 697 different genes. Holy shit! And some of the genes that influence height influence other traits as well. In total, the human genome contains as many as 25,000 different genes, and they tend to interact with one another and with environmental influences in complicated, still poorly understood ways. In sum, what have we learned? First, grit, talent, and all other psychological traits relevant to success in life are influenced by genes and also by experience, nature, and nurture. Second, there's no single gene for grit, or indeed any other psychological trait. Okay, that's what we've learned. I'd like to make a third important point. Heritability estimates why people differ from the average, but they say nothing about the average itself, while the heritability of height says something about variability. Why in a given population some people are taller and some shorter, it says nothing about how average height has changed. This is important because it provides evidence that the environment we grow up in really does matter. Here's another striking example, and one more relevant to the science of success, the Flynn effect. Named after John Flynn, the New Zealand social scientist who discovered it, the Flynn effect refers to startling gains in IQ scores over the past century. How big are the gains? On the most widely used IQ tests today, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children and the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, gains have averaged more than 15 points in the last 50 years in the more than 30 countries that have been studied. Put another way, if you scored people a century ago against modern norms, they would have an average IQ of 70, borderline for mentally retarded. If you scored people today against the norms of a century ago, we would have an average of 130, the typical cut score for mentally gifted programs. When I first learned about the Flynn effect, I didn't believe it. How could it be that we're all getting that much smarter so quickly? I called Jim to share my incredulity and my desire to learn more. And, globetrotter that he is, he actually flew all the way to Philadelphia to meet with me and give a talk on his work. At our first encounter, I remember thinking that Jim looked like a caricature of an academic. Tall, a little bony, wire-rimmed glasses, and a rather unruly head of curly steel-gray hair. Flynn began his talk with the basic facts on IQ change, digging through the raw scores of IQ tests taken over the years. He found that the improvements on some tests were much bigger than others. He went to the chalkboard and sketched out a steep line indicating that scores had climbed most sharply for IQ tests assessing abstract reasoning. For instance, many young children today can answer the question, dogs and rabbits, how are they alike? They might tell you that both dogs and rabbits are alive and that they're both animals. In the scoring manual, these answers only earn a half credit. Some children might go so far as to say that they're both mammals, and for that insight, they'd earn a full credit. In contrast, young children a century ago might look at you quizzically and say, dogs chase rabbits. 0 points. As a species, we're getting better and better at abstract reasoning by way of explaining massive gains in certain IQ subtests, but not in others. Flynn told a story about basketball and television. Basketball at all levels of competition has gotten more competitive over the last century. Flynn played a little ball himself as a student and remembers the game changing even within a few years. So what happened? According to Flynn, what happened was television. Basketball was a great game to watch on the small screen, and the exposure fueled the game's popularity. Once television became a household fixture, more kids started playing the game, trying left-handed layups, crossover dribbles, graceful hook shots. My tray has a graceful hook shot. And the other skills that seemed routine among star players. And by getting better, each kid inadvertently enriched the learning environment for the kids he or she was playing against. Because one thing that makes you better at basketball is playing with kids who are just a little more skilled. Flynn called this virtuous cycle of skill improvement the social multiplier effect, and he used the same logic to explain generational changes in abstract reasoning. More and more over the past century, our jobs and daily lives ask us to think analytically and logically. We go to school for longer, and in school we are asked more and more to reason rather than rely on rote memorization. Either small environmental differences or genetic ones can trigger a virtuous cycle. Either way, the effects are multiplied socially through culture because each of us enriches the environment of all of us. Here's a graph showing how grit scale scores vary by age. These are dated from a large sample of American adults, and you can see from the horizontal axis that the grittiest adults in my sample were in their late 60s or older. The least gritty were in their 20s. See that? Okay, so an explanation for this data is that there's a sort of reverse Flynn effect for grit. For instance, it's possible that adults in their 7th decade of life are grittier because they grew up in a very different cultural era. Perhaps one of those values and norms emphasize sustained passion and perseverance more than has been the case recently. In other words, it could be that the greatest generation is grittier than the millennials because cultural forces are different today than yesterday. This explanation for why grit and age go hand in hand was suggested to me by an older colleague who, looking over my shoulder at the same graph, shook his head and said, "I knew it. I've been teaching the same undergraduates the same course at the same university for decades, and I'll tell you, they just don't work as hard these days as they used to." My dad, who gave this entire professional life as a chemist to DuPont and quite literally retired with the gold watch, might say the same of the Wharton entrepreneur who approached me after my lecture. Even while pulling all-nighters for his present venture, the young man half expected to be on to something entirely new within a few years. Oh, I've already been going for 21 minutes and 41 seconds, y'all. Okay, 3 more pages of Grit Grows. Then we're doing growing grit from the inside out. Yes, so fun. Okay, so I've got some other shiznit that I need to go do. But thank you for listening, for joining me. And I'll be back, not tonight because I have an AA meeting, but tomorrow. I'll make the time tomorrow. Okay? Thanks, y'all. Mwah. Much love.